Heidegger. This is maybe too close. This will be better. Hello and most welcome to Heidegger 1042. And today I will talk about not knowing the realm of space and how that will cause the system to go haywire, not getting the necessary information to be localized, knowing where it is. And here something taken from Rapoport, Diego Lucio Rapoport, working in Tel Aviv, who has studied the topic of topology. And one of the gravest mistakes is that thinking topology refers to a specific area. And that could be pronounced something topology, geometry belongs to the sphere of physics. That is not something that could be understood on a scientific basis. It doesn't have any real meaning. Ununderstandable. Topology is what counts, and there is no possibility of dividing it, and every division would be not accurate, since the presupposition that it could be divided would be based on false ideas, or wrong ideas, or unthinking ideas. I think that's the best way to put it. And this is meaning for us as individuals that we cannot locate in the stream of consciousness, because space is formed like a Klein bottle. That means putting it into the three-dimensional idea, and with all these illusionary horrible effects, rather, I would say that people testify they can see spaces, they can see distances, they can see emptiness. None of these things can be seen, but saying such and thinking such is a sign that grave fragmentation is going on. Things are not doing their jobs. We are not in the world anymore. We are still moving about, and possibly from an outside perspective it could look like we don't move well. We are uncoordinated. We are not present in our talking, our thinking, our acting, and our predictive power is on the low side. Memory will not be working if you're not located. How can you find your memories if you not even know where you are? And I mentioned earlier this fear that is so common today, this fight and flight response that has rebuilt our bodies to be accustomed to live in a world of fear. That is infused with fear, and that there is a fragrance, a smell, an odor, I would say, of fear in everything what we construct. And this passive mood is also putting fear as an ingredient into the world, and how to use an Heideggerian term, how the objects then hide themselves. We don't reach into substance. The objects for us are just passing, non-permanent. It doesn't make sense for an ontic view, and doesn't make sense for an ontological view, why the object should be passing or non-permanent. That means nothing really to say that. It means that something within you is not working. You are not reaching out. You're not projecting. You have deconstructed your complexity level, so to speak. This is an unhealthy system. And we cannot do the things we want to do. We can't be who we want to be. And we can't be true. Because fear does not allow truthfulness. Your acts will be decided upon fear. This is the flight and fight response. These are the T2 neurons, T2 muscles, and the N2 neurons talking to each other. This is what leads to this sickly behavior of collapsing over relaxation versus / the other aspect, over tension, over rigidity, over sharpness in the voice, lack of lenient softness, the understanding voice that reaches out, touches others, and there is a transfer of information, of knowledge between. Whereas today we have the passive mood that doesn't send anything out to anyone else, and then of course you cannot receive anything. You have shut your ears because the ears needs to be active. We cannot focus, we constantly shift our inclinations. And this is how Ian McGilchrist describes a schizophrenic patient in one of his podcasts on his own homepage. He has started a series now, how the patients could focus, for instance, in one thing, then in another, and then in a third. But the concentration was over shallow, and the patient sort of complain, I'm not really even interested in the things I'm looking at. And I think he mentioned how the patient focuses, for instance, on a radiator, and there was no reason for that. There being no reason for the attention, this is the passiveness. And of course, we normal people don't experience to that level as a schizophrenic, but it could still be sort of a hint where it could go if let on its own devices to go wherever it wants. Maybe that's part and parcel of the modern problem. I wasn't really taught to go in a specific direction of my parents, and I think that was the modern times. Them thinking that there were no specific directions to go in, so why bother? Why bother and just call it modern upbringing? And I don't think they had a choice. Theirs in their hands was no direction to give. The modern times are like that. And then you're left to your own device, which is probably the most horrid thing you can be. For me it went well, but I saw so many other people going haywire. It's extremely dangerous, letting the child be whatever it wants, because he has to combat learning dimensionality. Everything is not given. It is giving up as a parent and putting the child in front of the lions of his inner and outer experience. That is also assuming that space has already always been there. Space and time is already there. So it's just for the child to passively walk in that space and pass that time somehow. Those are the same attitude as also Emma Kilkes points out in the same podcast, that can see distances in the world. Scary, bleak, non-connected distances, not having a purpose, not having a why, and they look at things as they were things separated from themselves, not with an objective. What can I do with it? What is it for me? What is my interest in it? No, this more schizophrenic, it takes away my awareness for a moment. This is unbalanced, and this is also fear, because you're not localized, then you will be in fear. A healthy body reacts that immediately, and a healthy mind, it's scared. In this non-localized world where you don't know where you are and you don't understand that space is in the Klein bottle, which is so much more complex and always takes in the subjects for its understanding. Although the understanding of space is completely objective, it can only be objective when it's subjective. That's the complementarity that doesn't make any sense, and it shouldn't, but that's the way the world is. Sometimes it makes a little sense to me, and then I don't understand it. It is not sensible, but that is the way of space. We will literally not find the way in the world. We will get lost. Be in it in the woods, in a city, in our own thinking, in the domain of your own room, or in the inner of your mental sphere where you can't find the memories, or you can't find the thoughts that you were thinking just a minute ago, or that association. Can you see here how this tendency destroys creativity? That once you got so far you have no inner understanding, creativity is going to be erased from the picture by fear. Fear doesn't have the economy for creativity. It needs just to survive. And that is not an invention. You do not literally know where you are. It is in such a situation is completely sane to be having fear. And I think, for instance, in the Alexander technique, that was pointed out indirectly sometimes by Frederick Matthias Alexander. But I think after that something happened, and all Alexander teachers seems to think that fear, the fight and flight response is unfounded and doesn't need to be there. And I even experienced myself how they attack people who have that reaction. Something I was exposed to myself, and I heard someone else mention that she under Congress got contact singled out for being afraid. And then she was blamed for that, sort of castigated. You shouldn't be afraid. There's nothing to be afraid of in the world. Well, I don't think that is completely correct. I would say that the fight and flight response is there for a purpose. Yes, could be that it becomes habituated. Maybe the scenario you get afraid and you get shocked and then you cling on to that is partly true. But the thing is, once it clings into action, you know less of where you are localized, and there is even more need for the fight and flight reaction. But it only goes to show that it might be that the Alexander technique is like Jeroen Staring, who wrote the book about Frederick Matthias Alexander, that the modern Alexander technique has maybe the smell of a sect. They understood something, there is too much fear going on, but they didn't really have the tools or the means or the capabilities and knowledge to get rid of it, because that takes in changing the world and changing yourself. Physics cannot be left out of the picture. Flying bottle is not something localized in the world, it is the world, and that is quite different. The same difference like being and beings, to give a hint here. We will not have our up and we will not have our down. We won't know what is forward. We won't know what is backward. Therefore, of course, we will not have a poise. We will have a posture. It will be rigid. It will be fixated. It will not be smooth, ready to action. It is locked in fear. To be locked in fear is having the all rigor of the Newtonian coordinate system in place, and you tense yourself to uphold it, to have this empty space and see distances. Of course, you can never see distances, but this is what you say you saw. This is the blackness, and then when you see the blackness or don't perceive anything, then you said, I see distance. It's you telling yourself you have no idea where you are. And we will neither find our way in time. We won't know what knowledge is or what is useful knowledge. It will be a sort of a superficial take on the world, where nothing goes into depth or the reality of everything. It will be a smell of the world that is faint, almost dim. And in the end, you can't say whether the world or a certain part of the world is smelling badly or smelling good. You will not be able to see immoral acts from moral acts. It will not help if you go to the church every day, and how many holy scriptures you will read. It will not change the fact, because you yourself have shut your ears or your eyes to what is said in the text. I'm getting into that soon about texts. And the sensory system will be alarmed, and all impressions will be tainted with, well, firstly, less perceptual information that will be very bleak and bland, not really real, not strong, not present, but also they will have all the flavor of fear. Everything will be underlined with fear. And one hinting thing there is usually no smell there, because the system is shutting off smell. It's one of the most robust things connected to fear, and since we have almost no need for smell when we run away from something, that sense go. Which is a shame, because smell is incredibly important to put us in a good position, to localize us. Right? Very connected to presence. Let me strengthen the argument. In quantum mechanics there are simply none of space and time before the projection. And I am talking about the Wheeler-de Wit equation. There is no time and space in that one, because time and space in quantum mechanics are real things. They're not hypothesized before the fact. They are something that comes out of experience. When you meet the world, the observer is there. And to have time and space before experience is the same as saying that they are transcendental or non-existent, that you can never have any knowledge of them. So whereas it sounds very nice in Newtonian physics until a certain point, well, you have time and space. Well, that time and space is before the fact. In quantum mechanics, time and space is something you listen into after you projected. After you send out the projection, your direction, and that one you need to train, because you will not naturally be equipped with it. We do live in a classical physical world. There is no need for it, and that means it will have atrophied, will not be present from the beginning. It cannot be present in anyone. It wouldn't have a purpose, it wouldn't be valued. Presence and being is simply things we discard. And we go to look for what we call supplements or traces of something completely else and look for that instead. This is why quantum mechanics doesn't come about easily. There are good reasons for that. You can lead a donkey to the water, but you can't force it to drink. We will not appreciate the gifts that quantum mechanics brings, because we are used to other things. Donkey used to thirst might not even be interested in quenching its thirst. Could actually be the case. Do think about that possibility. This is also what is meant by time and space being passive. It is like a very mild projection of time and space that you do when you're being passive. Still do it, because all perception is active, and you're so unaware of it, but still it's there, but it's less, it has less complication. Three-dimensionality cannot be exploded, or what could you say? One could say that Klein bottle logic, Klein bottle dimensions could be a projection. They could, from them, it could be a projection to three-dimensional space, but it's not absolutely true. But the opposite can never happen. You can never start with three-dimensionality and understand space. It has this taint of being passive, because Klein bottle logic shows that you need to go into space. Your subjective side of the whole thing is part of space. How odd it might even sound, and I think it should sound odd. It should not be something that makes any sense at all. Yes, it's proven, you could say, but you shouldn't understand it. It shouldn't be understandable. To a certain extent, even the term unheimlich would be fit here. But still, that is our birthplace. This is from where everything is coming. And once we get into it, you see that it has many gifts to bring. Because everything that is in the three-dimensionality is already in the flying bottle logic, but so much more. And whereas there is exact positioning in the Newtonian space, the Klein bottle logic is non-local. Things cannot be localized in the regular manner of X, Y, Z. You need to be there, and it's always a level of localization. There's no absolute localization in the Klein bottle. In space, nothing can be absolutely localized. It could be more and more localized. It could be less and less and less. Whereas in classical physics, it's more of an either-or. More of an either-or, I should say. Because you go into other things like how big is the point on that, you run into some problem. But it's more or less, you have an exact positions that is fitting the situation in classical physics. But that's not the case in quantum mechanics, Klein bottle. You can reach exactness on an endless scale. It's a bit iterative, fractal in that mode. You are very important in quantum mechanics. The subject is very important, and that has been more or less neglected. And this is the problem with surface knowledge, as I call it, or the surfaces of opaque objects, which is so much the way of knowing things today. You just know the things by their name, their shape. You give names directly to the voice of the friend and so forth. You give names to the birds you see and so forth. You name them, capture them, and you don't let them speak, be seen, be heard, be smelt, be tasted. It's a bit like McDonald's. One of the problems with McDonald's, or advantages, is that it's pre-packed. And I mean this in another sense. I mean that it says hamburger on the package, you've been there before, and that will project a certain taste, for good or bad, to the hamburger. And I think there is an awareness of that. Possibly, I don't think it leads to lack of quality, but it leads to a almost repetitive-like experience. And that repetitive-like experience is something we prefer today. You want to know what you get somehow. Well, of course you're going to get consistency in the experience of a hamburger. But I don't remember my mom's hamburger to always taste the same. She used the same recipe, all right, yes, in the same way I'm making them. But they're always different, and I remember I liked that. And somewhere on the way I went from iteration to repetition. Maybe I was 17, and I preferred, actually, my taste had become, I really wanted to have that hamburger, that cheeseburger. Because my expectations, and this is something that we need to understand, it actually will make the taste of the hamburger better, a projection. This is very interesting. Of course I could have projected more to the hamburger of my mother. Maybe I've forgotten how, or some other reason. But you get my drift. Projection is important. That does not mean that a hamburger is any better or worse. But it does, doesn't it? Yeah. It does, actually. So projection is neither good nor bad, but it can be used to your benefits. And doing projection in a more complicated way, that is usually the key point. Because projecting, we are always doing. And remember that Newtonian physics is still projecting. You project the idea, but you do it in a lesser way. It's the amount of projection that is the difference. They don't differ in quality. They differ in amount, force, quantity. There is a quantitative difference between classical physics and quantum mechanics, not a qualitative difference. It's more of everything in quantum mechanics, it's less in the other one. But that also goes to show you need to have a focus projection, more complicated. And I think our way of wanting to make things complicated, complex, because we have a hunch that there is the good stuff, that could be misled somehow. It could have turned into Trivial Pursuit game, where it's too much of surface knowledge will induce lack of deeper knowledge. Let me give you an example. This is the next paragraph, how we shut our minds, and that shutting of the minds won't be as you might expect now from the outset. You will hear it's quite different, and but that is the paragraph now. Think of a person who lives in the Amazon. He will be very balanced, he will be upright, exquisitely good in orienting himself, both in familiar areas and also in non-familiar areas. They are testamentally good at orienting themselves. But according to our way of knowledge, the modern day of knowledge, do they have a lot of knowledge? Then we will say directly no. Their scope is very small, we will say. They are limited. They are biased. And I would say that bias, that limitation needs to be there for us to have complexity. Because we only see on the surface level. Sort of parallel here could be, to give some indication, the game of Trivial Pursuit. Those who are good at that could actually exclude within themselves deeper knowing by making knowledge, the world itself, of lesser quantity. Although it looks like quantitatively a lot, it is actually less. So you need, because you enter into a world, and that world has its complexity. Doesn't an Indian in the Amazon enter into the world, the Klein bottle? Well, maybe we might say from our vantage point, no, it's just simple space they're living in the Amazon. Doesn't have any specific details. Well, different trees, maybe some would say some herbs. Well, the Klein bottle says even if it were to look exactly the same, it wouldn't be the same. But people seem to neglect the complexities out there that are quite different. And of course the Indian will have extreme complexities when it comes to understanding that world, even though it's scoped from a certain perspective. Let's call that space level 1. From that perspective it doesn't have any depth to it or complexity. I would claim it does, for to actually project forcefully, the shallow scope needs to be narrowed down. In the same way, a magnifying glass would be an excellent thing if I had one here. A magnifying glass, its whole purpose is to zoom in, to get all sun in one spot, the whole area of the magnifying glass on one spot. And the Amazon Indian is doing the same thing. You get more space, time and knowledge if you can focus in. And that broadness will induce that you stop that. That broad knowing, allmän kunskap as we say in Sweden, that could actually stop that. I think it does. If you confuse that with knowing, knowing the world, knowing space, knowing time, having knowledge, then you made a huge mistake. But if you take it for what it is and put it on a very low position, not making it important, and hopefully only mentioning it when you're playing Trivial Pursuit, it doesn't have to be a problem. Otherwise it will be problematic. Think of Jan Myrdal, maybe when it comes to the broad knowledge, one of those incredibly knowledgeable persons. His library at home contained, I think it was like 50,000 books. And whoever asked him a question, he knew that, but it was the broad, shallow knowledge. So he made his magnifying glass extremely shallow, so he couldn't gain depth. He was spreading out, and he didn't make a difference between the levels of knowledge. Maybe that is the better way of pronouncing the whole thing. He didn't say that someone more shallow, for instance, knowledge you self have experienced, eye to eye, in the reality, in space, in knowing, that has a deeper intellectual level as things that you just heard about, and you might never ever be able to go into, like a description of something that is in the past and in a place that is no longer visible, like old Persia, for instance. His knowledge became very, very shallow, and I think to most foreigners, when it was translated, he didn't look like an intellectual at all. But the way of seeing it qualitatively for Sweden would be, and superficial people from other countries would deem him to be still intellectual somehow. I can't see that. Didn't seem like a rough bag, making short judgments about everything and being of no demeanor, giving no impression of any intellectual standards at all. None. And of course, it was never an option for him, but having this broad and shallowness must have made it much worse. It puts a scenario that is malignant into something that is super malignant. I'm going to put a pause there and add another subject to this. Just give me a second here. So I'd say that this Jan Myrdal, without a doubt, is suffering from fear, or having fear of the world. And the world he superficially constructs is because of his shallower neurons too. The fast twitch neurons that can't build up a deeper worldview, cannot see complexities. It's an either-or picture that actually block out knowledge. One of those most astonishing features of this Swedish intellectual was that he was the only person in this world who ever to defend Albania when it was a communist dictatorship. Not even the sternest communists liked it. And I remember there were huge attacks on him, and nobody saw, maybe, poor chap, he didn't have any experience of the world. For otherwise, could he say those things? And there is an absurd misunderstanding that people can twist reality. We cannot twist reality, but we can have lesser access to reality, and that's quite a different way. And this is this whole myth about bias and takes down projection, because only when we have firm beliefs, when we have absolute things that we believe in, that we project, no matter what of the outside. Only then we can have reality. And Jan Myrdal did not do that, trust me. He was a fearful man, full of fear, and he ingested fear in others. And of course, this is the defense from metaphysics of presence, that reality is really out there. And Jan Myrdal was just being subjective. Hey, come on. This is as absurd as no idea. It is always and 100% a lack of deception. Reality is truly there, but it will not come to the fore. It will not open itself up if you don't first project. And he didn't do anything about the thing. He was absolutely passive. His knowing was not active. He didn't have a kernel within him that he never moved. That kernel, I would say, is placement, actively placing yourself in the in the Klein bottle. Because the only way for you to localize yourself is to pick a point on the Klein bottle. Why is that? Well, it's from an outtake of XYZ, easily demonstrated. I can recommend one of the YouTube clips. There is an abundance of them because Klein bottle is an important part of medium complicated math all over the world. Pick one of them and you will see that things are not localizable on the Klein bottle or in the Klein bottle, whatever you prefer. Both works, just because of the prepositions I mentioned. But you can pick a place, any place. And if you pick a place at random, but in a decidedly way, then you can have localization in contrast to other things. It will not be an XYZ localization, but it will be a localization. I would say more complex. Actually, in the first take, it would be good to, like little by little, loosening that up and say it could be XYZ. Yeah, I think that would actually work. But you chose your own origo. That is the difference. And you do that by your own mind. Not based on something. And that is the true origo. That will be true origo. And that decidedness is your projection. That's the first of the twofold, the first leg of the journey to realizing, understanding reality. And it should be directed narrow in a way. Have a narrow focus if you compare to that broadness of Jan Myrdal. Only then it will be able to be stable enough and reach into the complexity, because it will be forceful enough. So maybe all the 50,000 books are Jan Myrdal, but not an inkling of complexity. Take away 48,000 books and you would have books enough for a lifetime. If they are well chosen, that is. And then you expand them from within. Assuming you pick the right books. It needs to be the books that contain knowledge. That firm standing down is very important. Because if you don't firmly meet reality, it will not give a response. It's like meeting a friend downtown. You say hey, the other one says hey. You reach out firmly with projection. Your hey will be firmly answered. This is the same way. You need to be projected. And that does not make you biased. Well, it does. It does make you biased. Of course, from the point of view of the first level of space, time, and knowledge, it does. Pretty definitely. But if you want to transgress to a higher level, not saying anything will be wrong in all levels, but depending on the level you are in, there is a difference. And in the second level, this is not seen as dogmatic. That will be dogmatic on the first level. It will literally be dogmatic on the first level. Because your inside, what is the shape of the inside will change what comes out. In the same way, if we were to put me into the Amazon jungle, it won't be the same jungle. How could it be? So this firm belief, this firm base will open up reality and will make it play the harmonies on the string guitar, and it will be much more strings. That firm foundation is a necessity to be more open, whereas on the first level it would be a prejudiced person in some ways. But in some other ways, it will be a non-knowing person. This has to do with the chapter of polar knowledge I mentioned before. Standing next to a wasp's nest.
What place to be?
This passive knowing creates polarity. That we decided preemptively that the world is passive. This is the amnesia. This is the metaphysical turn in Western tradition. Might be that it is traceless, as was suggested by Casey. Didn't leave a trace even. Interesting thought. But they wanted somehow to take away the subject and just have one part. And that is somehow the reverse of me thinking that putting together particle and wave in quantum mechanics will be 1 + 1. It doesn't really work that way, but it's hard to uphold that that's not the same. And that could be going from the first level to the second level of space and time, where other things are allowed without breaking the system, actually making it stronger, more knowledgeable. Understanding can deepen within the same phrase. The voice of the friend can be one of many items in the big library of Jan Myrdal, but it can also be something that speaks deeply. You really hear into it, and you don't deem it to be a friend or an enemy even from the beginning. You let it be. And that, I think, is only possible if you project really clearly. It's in the beginning, it takes effort, like a sort of thinking bodily effort. Need to be here, present in a way that both disregards presence or taking absence, so to speak. The absence of what is behind me, and thereby making it much clearer, distincter. Could be the two brain halves of me and McGilchrist coming together and both cooperating and both being completely different. It's a bit of a koan, as the Japanese would say, spelled K-O-A-N, koan. I'll read a little bit more about this passive knowledge from page 112 in Love of Knowledge. And I would say this is the knowledge from So let's continue with polar knowledge. The thought up division between us and the exterior, and the thought up division between what is existence and what is non-existence, that has great affinity also to what we mentioned earlier, the findings of the great mathematician in England, Morley, I think his name was, who discovered that we only need space to understand every feature of reality. We don't need existences, and that was also, Moseley was his name, and that was also the insight from Auger Bohr, and that is important because space takes a role. Space is not something that is away from us, not part of our lives. It is internally very, very important in our lives, and it makes the whole difference if it's let to come into the picture, to come to the fore. So let's continue here. Disconnected knowledge. An act of polar knowing depends on transporting information through space and time, from there and then to here and now. For example, a simple model of a visual perception might describe light as reflecting off an object and entering the eye, where it then excites a cascading sequence of processes that are in some way converted into a datum of knowledge. But is the knowledge gained in this way accurate? What guarantees that the object has remained unchanged in the interval between then and now, or that the image formed here is a true likeness of an object there? Let us look at this from the point of view of the perceiver. Having directed attention toward an object, the perceiver sets out a journey from here to there and from now to then. But when it arrives at its destination, it finds that the there has become here and the then has become now. The original object of inquiry will always be situated in a time and a place that remain wholly inaccessible. The difficulty is twofold. Knowledge is possible only in the future when the perceiver makes contact with the perceived. Yet what can be known is only the object as it was in the past. A similar problem with connections arises with respect to the momentary structure of polar knowing. In conventional understanding, a moment is the span of time necessary to hold a single discrete event. If this was not so, and a moment could hold more than one event, it would be difficult to maintain that those events were separated from each other. Thus, it seems that the perceiver must know in a single moment of time. This is so even from another perspective, that the moment is the outcome of previous moments in which information is collected, received, etc. Based on this view, the momentary act of perceiving uses up its moment with no remainder, since whatever remained would be another moment. But even if moments seem best understood as complete in themselves, knowing cannot be solely a momentary operation. The meaning-giving constructs of the human world depends on moments being linked together to establish descriptive knowledge. Our lives unfold in a time, in a from and to structure that imparts significance in the same way that the melody brings coherence to musical notes. Thoughts, intentions, and emotions all depend on the connection between moments. Next paragraph. Linking moments to knowledge. Consider what takes place when an object first appears within the perceiver's field of vision. This sudden presence of the object can be established only by being linked to the non-presence of the same object in the previous moment. If the object is still present in the next moment, this continuing presence must likewise be linked to the previous moment of being present. The structure of human experience depends fundamentally on just such linkages. Without them, there could be no knowledge that something had appeared or was present. If moments remained irrevocably separated from one another, or if they all arise simultaneously, the world in which we live and act cannot possibly emerge into our awareness. How is this vital link, which you normally take for granted, possible? Let us ask first with regard to the perceiver. For a link between moments of perception to take place, there must be a way for the perceiver in one moment to know what has occurred in the previous moment. But the perceiver operates only now. Knowledge obtained in an earlier moment situated then will be available, if at all, only as an object for perception. The perceiver must thus perceive or know two things, seemingly at once. The immediate momentary object of knowledge, already situated in its own past then, and the previous object of knowledge, or rather, the content of the previous act of knowing. There is another, equally universal kind of linking. Suppose that in one moment we recognize or observe an object. In the next moment we may view what we consider to be the same object, but now through a different lens or filter. For example, we may see a car and then hear it going by. Although we might merge these two acts of knowing in our awareness, it seems that each occurs independently, for the two sense fields are separated from each other. Even if we said that these two acts take place in the same moment, for example, if they are processed simultaneously by different parts of the brain, in referring these momentary knowledge acts to the same object, we somehow relate them. Giving name to the voice. This relating is another distinct act. How does it take place? It cannot be an activity within each moment, for we have seen that activities such as seeing and hearing fully use up their respective moments without remainder. If we say that the relating occupies a third, intermediate moment, this moment must in turn be related to those that come before and after, establishing an infinite regress. We seem able to escape this endless chain only by saying that there is a separate linking between moments that is not itself momentary, through which connection, meaning and interpretation can emerge into being. A phantom bridge. For the perceiver situated within a particular moment in time, the link between moments and the linear progression from one moment to the next cannot be directly observed. From the perspective of such a perceiver, it might be equally true that time is random in occurrence. The conventional sense of specific occasions and sequences bound together in a definite order might be a construct superimposed by the observing mind. If we pursue these possibilities out far enough, even the idea that time proceeds in moments where the linear or random might have to be abandoned. Although the sense that moments of time are linked together is basic to all our understanding, what do we know about such non-momentary linking? Consider as a kind of bridge, it must have a beginning and ending, a way of spanning the gap between one moment and the next. But the mechanism of spanning or transition remains unknown, even when we succeed in contacting rather subtle levels of mental experience. If the bridge between moments is a phenomenon different from moments, what is its nature? From within moment to moment polar knowledge, it makes sense only to describe it as a gap between. If this gap is truly just empty, how can it serve as a bridge? If it's not empty, is it occupied in some way? And is this occupant some different kind of perceiver? For the problem arises with special force in reference to the initial moment of knowing in series, which stands in an indeterminate relation to a previous moment of not knowing. How can a moment of not knowing be linked to a moment of knowing? For the link to be established, there must be some common ground between the first moment and the second. But how can an unknowing have anything in common with what it does not yet know? Widening puzzle. Such difficulties had consequences beyond the scope of knowledge gained through observation. For example, deductive reasoning depends on logic rather than temporal observation. But logic itself rests on the fundamental principle of identity and contradiction. Two things cannot at the same time be both the same and different. When successive moments of knowing cannot be linked, however, simultaneity does not apply, and the logic of identity and contradiction falls away. What was impossible in one moment might be possible in the next. What was black then might now be white. The entire moment-to-moment structure of time that polar knowledge presupposes seems subject to the same kind of difficulty. As a result, the world available through descriptive knowledge comes under the question in a fundamental way. Either the knowledge that we have learned to rely on has no real basis, or it has its basis in a source we do not know. All such difficulties arise from the basic structure of polar knowledge. When knowing is limited to a single moment in time, how can what is known be transported from one moment to the next in a way that validates its authenticity? Where and when will the validation take place? When knowledge remains isolated from moment to moment, can it qualify as knowledge at all? Observe in your own experience the flow of time from one moment to the next. If the mind is calm and alert, you might notice that between two initially observed moments A and B lie other intermediate moments. Practice observing from moment to moment in a way that makes available on an even smaller scale moments between moments. And this is zooming in on the Norwegian coast, and it's rather groovy that this book, written in 1970, when was it? 87, is 13 years earlier than Susie Frobel in sort of arguing about direct perception rather than having this twofold perception or two-step perception. First you see the world and then you acknowledge it's on the retina of your eye, and then you calculate it that, and then the homunculus will see it somehow, some inside your head on a screen. This is a very early argument against that, which is surprisingly, to say the least. And moments between moments is exactly the Norwegian coastline. Let me go into the next one. It's called Missing Links. I think I need to put some sun on here. Sorry for the break there. I will continue. I thought a bit. So seeing things in between is more the solution, and it could be many dividing points there in between moments. And this is something that Xenon got wrong. He did not divide. He said you can divide from one objective position, and then each division, both for the hair's time and the turtle time, would be the same somehow. But the question that he didn't ask was, from where would it be the same? They would not be in the same position, the hare and the turtle. So there are some problems forgotten there or not observed. But you can be pretty sure they were never asked by anyone, because they needed only to be asked to sort of reveal the problem, Xenon. Continue to next chapter, 15, Missing Links. Coming from where, depending on when, transported through what, connections which, sequence how empowered. This is called compelling flow of time. The difficulties with linear flow of time seem closely tied to the view that polar knowledge is momentary. Accordingly, it has sometimes been suggested that time is not momentary in structure, that the present is somehow broad enough to encompass more than one moment. But even assuming this approach does not create more problems than it solves. The movement of time from past, but even assuming this approach does create more problem than it solves. The movement of time from past to present to future remains a necessary prerequisite for the conventional order to establish itself. I actually corrected the spelling error in print there. If we set aside for now the problems that arise in linking together separate moments, how does the more fundamental structure of linear temporal flow from the past to the future fare under analysis? Next paragraph, a linear unfolding. When something appears, where does it come from? Conventional understanding based on temporal knowledge answers that present appearance depends on the past. Each moment, even in a broad sense, in which the moment encompasses more than an instant, arises from the preceding moment. Whatever exists now traces its origins to events occurring earlier in time. Even a stable object, such as a mountain, exists on the basis of having been formed over millions of years. On a more tightly focused view, the mountain exists in this moment on the basis of having existed in the moment just before. Yet, how can the past hold such a wealth of possibilities? Does each earlier moment already encompass within it the potential for all succeeding moments of time? Did the first moment contain within it some unexpressed form of everything that has ever happened and will ever happen? Causal determinism of any kind seem to point in this direction. In the first moment of time did contain all succeeding moments in some inchoate form, a whole series of fundamental questions would arise. What makes a linear time unfold as it does? Why should there ever be a first moment? And why should its potential contents, the entire range of events in time, come into being in sequence rather than all at once, or in some different order? What brings the flow of time into being at all? What purpose does it satisfy? What motive does it fulfill? Does it make sense to speak of motives or purposes existing prior to time or beyond it? Or do such notions only reveal the limits of time-bound linear thinking? What can be said about the first moment of time? Did anything precede it? Question put by Allan Emreen. How could a first moment come into being without having a past of its own? If it had a beginning, did this originating act occur in another, more basic kind of time? If the first moment did arise within a more basic primordial time, how could it ever originate a flow of conventional time? Without standing in relation to a linear past, could it give rise to the linear future? What would it even mean to give rise to the linear flow of time, when giving rise seems to require the flow of time in order to occur. What was the first moment caused? If it was not caused, did it just arise accidentally from nowhere without any cause? Did some power bring it to being in an unimaginable acausal way? If we say the first moment originated in an unknown, perhaps unknowable source beyond linear time, or suggest that an equally unknowable source establishes a time without beginning, are we referring to something possibly real, or have we just succeeded in finding a sophisticated way of acknowledging our not knowing? Would such a power or source beyond time itself be timeless? Or is beyond time just a pointless bit of talk, called into being by a trick of language? Does it refer to time beyond time in this universe? Then what if there were another universe with a different kind of time? Which time would be beyond which? The whole idea of prior to time or outside of time remains linked to time in a way that seems inescapable. Even the idea of timeless must be related to the human sense of time. The standards for measurement and for structures of thought that we can bring to bear all relate to human scale of comprehension and to the dimensions of human experience. Dasein. Nota bene. Outside of time, living within linear time, we may be unable to conceive of any other form of time, much as a fish cannot form any understanding of dry land. To speak of timeless or before time may be a faulty extrapolation from the world we know. It may be that our language, which has built-in assumptions about beginning and before, leads us astray when we try to use it to encompass what goes beyond conventional experience. The same difficulty, however, seems to apply even to the understanding of conventional temporality. For example, how can we measure out time? When we speak of moments of time, we apply a construct based on conventional experience and on descriptive temporal knowledge. How can we truly know that what is being measured has anything to do with time as such? As has sometimes been pointed out, the structure of temporal moment, back to the originating moment or forward to the end of time, may say more about the human mind and how it shapes experience than about time itself. Assuming that it's possible to make sense of such an unknowable construct as time itself. Again, the common understanding accepts the idea of a sphere of mental activity that remains unconscious, in the sense that it's not normally accessible to the conscious mind. Suppose that time operated in a completely different way in such an unconscious realm than it does in the physical realm and in conscious experience. If this were so, we would seem to have no way of knowing it to be so. Yet, if there is an unconscious realm, it might well be that conscious experience is vitally dependent on such unconscious patterns of time. Even in conscious experience, there is a subtle aspect to the temporality of sense awareness and thoughts. Their arising and passing away, their inner dynamic and interconnections, that is not normally accessible to direct investigation. Is the structure of linear time adequate for exploring such phenomena, or does temporality instead hide them from view? If the linear structure of time is open to question, the basis for the world known through descriptive knowledge collapses. For descriptive knowledge depends on the general validity of the premise that what was true in the past and is not specifically acknowledged to be subject to change is true in the present as well. If the link between the past and present, or even the existence of past, present and future as such is uncertain, there can be no relying on descriptions at all. And here's a favorite part of mine: description and memory. We have seen that if descriptive knowledge is to be accurate, there must be a link between the moment being described and the moment of description. This link proved on an investigation to be difficult to establish. But even if linear time allowed for such a structure, the inherent logic of descriptive knowledge tends to undermine it. When we try to link together two moments, what we bring into contact are not the original moments at all, but our memories of those moments. Presupposed in the act of linking is the promise that what is remembered is related in some way to the original event. Perhaps this premise can be accepted on practical grounds, since it seems to give us the information required to act in the world, and can be verified by comparing our memory against the memories of other observers. But this justification, while roughly workable, collapses under investigation. And memory may be related to the event it purports to call to mind, but that relationship is not a perfect correspondence. The moment presented to memory reflects other structures and memories, assumptions and presuppositions. The subject of memory depends on the memory of the subject. It seems that a filter inevitably interposes itself between the event or experience and the memory of it. The past cannot be present even in memory. The sound that we hear in memory is at best the echo of the sound that we heard originally, and it is only by stipulation that we can say the echo is an accurate one. Is there any other way to validate what we call to mind? When we can rely only on memory, descriptive knowledge is suspect from the beginning. Is this in fact the case? Does conventional knowledge have no more substantial basis? A little summary. The linear unfolding of time, the first moment and its origin, source beyond time, temporal flow as construct, possibility of unconscious time, link between moments and memories, memory in doubt. All these things has been discussed in neurology and science of cognition, and we also recognize the metaphysics of presence, because if you believe in this, or this is your gestalt, will cause a lack, because you are not in the moment. You cannot be. The logic excludes that 100%. And therefore, it's not hard to understand metaphysics of presence coming into being. As an exercise on chapter 15, review the events of the past few hours, starting with the present moment, proceeding backwards. Sights, sounds and tastes, conversations, thoughts, judgments, interpretations, even other memories can be included as events for review. In what sense are you reliving these memories? What is your vantage point? Can it be varied? You can also practice this exercise at the end of each day to cultivate a clarity or diffuse residues of tension. As an alternative, instead of starting a review from the present, review time situated in the more distant past. (16) Replication into the whole. Constructs built to, specifications based on. Constructs placed aligned, defined in mirror image, to build constructs. Replication of the whole. Synchronicity or what, I don't know. Modeling self-constructs. The patterns that we observe in analyzing memory also operate on a level still more fundamental to the founding of descriptive knowledge. Descriptions are in essence constructs, arising in dependence on categories and definitions supplied by language, collective knowledge and personal experience. The original experience to which constructs are applied, whether we understand it in terms of polar knowledge or not, remains inaccessible, as though we were trying to experience the feel of a fur coat by touching it with gloves on. If the world understood as the underlying reality, regarding which we set out to obtain knowledge, is known only through constructs imposed on it, is this truly knowledge at all? How can we tell that what we know is not simply the reflection of the constructs through which our knowing arises, that we are looking not for a clear glass but at a mirror? Ordinary knowledge could be described as knowledge built up through models, explanations or descriptions of how things work within a specified domain. These models provide the mental constructs that claim to represent with some accuracy the objective reality that appears in conventional space and time. Starting as children and continuing into adulthood, we follow a standard pattern for gaining knowledge. First, we accept a basic model, then we gain sophistication in its use, possibly refining or modifying it in light of new facts, experience, or changed circumstances. We learn to work with models through other models that we have as the content, the valid ways of forming models and communicating knowledge. Our model of education accepts the idea that knowledge is transmitted through the imparting of models, while our model of science gives us way to verify or disapprove models. The presentation being made in this paragraph is still another model about models. Certain kinds of models are frequently subject to questioning and revision. For example, those that present scientific explanation of formal philosophical positions. Other models, however, tend to go unquestioned. The model that establishes models as a valid way to transmit new knowledge is one such model. Another is the model linking knowledge to the senses. Still, a third is the model that establishes the correlative existence of a knowing self that endures over time on the one hand, and an objective world, I shouldn't point, populated by enduring objects that are carriers of sensory data on the other. Such models are so familiar to us that we may never reflect on them explicitly or notice them in operation. And because each model supports and draws support from countless others, a structure is created that is far too complex to be examined as a whole. As a result, we lose sight of the difficulties and contradictions that interacting models generate, and simply accept the knowledge such models provide as the way things are. If we inquire into the reason for accepting such models, the basic answer would seem to be that they seem to fit with our experience. But while this appeal to experience is powerful, its validity depends on another model, one that defines models as true when they conform to experience, or alternatively, when they have predictive power or meet certain criteria of elegance, simplicity, etc. I would to this add rules of correctness, which has sort of replaced wisdom and understanding the last 50 years in academia. There it's all rules of correctness these days, because everyone should be able to go into the university. And we have simple rules, just boxes to click in. Yes and no. Yes, he understands. Let him pass. It seems doubtful that authentication at this level can be successful, that a model can bear witness for another model. After all, our usual understanding might be reversed. The prevailing models might match our experience because we shape experience to conform to the models. Our real reasons for accepting the validity of prevailing models might be based on a different set of concerns entirely. As long as models can be said to work, perhaps it does not matter very much if they remain unfounded. Even if in the end we can rely only on blind faith, our reliance may be justified in terms of what it accomplishes, or on the basis of other, less immediately obvious criteria. Whatever the specific grounds we advance, however, there are good grounds for investigating further, for it seems that reliance on models limits knowledge in fundamental ways. What models leaves out? In the first place, models tend to freeze out possibility of fundamental change. The model establishes a pattern that allows for only certain kinds of events and certain sequences in which events can unfold. Events that do not conform to such sequences may be flatly ruled out, or else placed outside the scope of possible knowing. If change unauthorized by the model occurs, it will be unlawful, like miracles, my adding. In certain kinds of models it might consider miraculous. In others it might be ascribed to a freakish set of circumstances, explained away or simply ignored as beneath notice. Because models restrict the kinds of change available to be known, they work against our ability to adapt to our surroundings. History offers frequent examples of individuals, social groups, and entire cultures that adhere to a way of life or a set of beliefs that restricted knowledge, rendering them unable to deal with new circumstances. Like the Inca, for instance. Despite their usefulness, there are times when models can be destructive, even dangerous. Second, models tend to allow only knowledge that fits within the basic structure of polar and descriptive knowledge. This structure works well as a basis for knowing only when applied to events that are rigidly and routinely repeated. Knowledge that does not accord with this pattern of mechanical repetition, which underlies the basic effectiveness of descriptive knowing, tends to be lost or overlooked. When we know from models, we know that the same patterns recur over time, and it becomes natural, even inevitable, to say that progress comes only slowly, or that human nature cannot be changed, or that our destiny is in the hands of faith. Third, knowledge based on models is distanced from direct experience in favor of conceptual structures. Since models are conceptual, the knowledge that they lead to will consist of a steady succession of thoughts and images. Though this flow in itself embodies a vital energy, the focus of the models is on the content of each thought in turn. As one fixed idea succeeds another, the vivid immediacy of experience is lost. Immediate experience may be the source of knowledge that the model expresses. But when this knowledge is put in the form of a model, transmitted from person to person, this source is not directly communicated. Instead, knowledge is recast as technology or as belief. While other possibilities for knowing recede from view. Finally, models turn our attention away from direct inquiry into the unfounded assumptions of the models themselves. Well, that's a tricky one. When we label something as good or bad in terms that the model establishes, we tend not to ask why the good is good. If it can only be good in relation to bad, then why is bad bad? Knowing from within the model, we may find such questions as meaningless as the endlessly repeated whys of a young child. But this sense of questions as being without meaning is based on the model's juxtaposing presuppositions to establish an order, complete with identified entities and excluded alternatives. Such juxtaposition stops inquiry before it has rightly begun. Because limitation of knowledge are built-in feature of the model, they become inevitable. Once in operation, model-based knowledge is self-perpetuating. If we try to ask why the assumptions of models are beyond questioning, the answer comes from within another model. For example, models of discourse or inquiry may define the scope of rationality in such a way that reliance on pre-established axioms is a logical necessity. A very different set of models may make certain kinds of knowledge accessible only to faith. But the invoking of such additional models only serves to underscore the lack of knowledge inherent in the models as such. In each model, then, there is a place that remains impenetrable. The limited knowledge allowed within the model is positioned in a specific way, for example as wisdom, rationality, faith, empirical truth, etc. A line is established beyond which knowledge cannot go. Let's sum this up. Knowledge built up through models, a model for transmitting knowledge, the unfounded appeal to experience, models as freezing out change, knowledge and direct experience, models as impenetrable to knowledge due to positioning. Cloud of knowing is the exercise for this. Ordinarily, we look at objects, forms and shapes and events from one perspective at a time, a simple linear relationship that can be understood either temporally or spatially. A to B. Viewed more closely, observation does not follow this simple linear path. As we observe one thing, other thoughts, images and judgment may come to mind. Again, the object we are observing may reveal new aspects or dimensions, or we may see it from different perspectives. Observe perceptual situations with sensitive toward this non-linear complexity. And I would say it is linear, but it's also non-linear in a way. Well, I say thank you very much. Look at this beautiful view. It's burned out, but it's still lovely. And do be careful out there. Bye-bye.